Okay, you all. Um, it is Wednesday. This was supposed to be posted on Sunday. Um, I had a whole nother recording of this lecture done already, but for some reason it got lost, corrupted. I'm not really sure what happened, but I am redoing this because obviously it wasn't posted and obviously you guys aren't getting this information. So we are going to go through the lecture now. I'm going to redo it. Um, but key points to know. So I got a lot of emails about the lecture, which is beautiful because that means that you guys are on top of it. Um, Number one thing, the group presentations. You guys should be doing that starting now, starting last week. So that's something that should have been started last week. Once you guys got your groups, I told you in on Canvas to immediately start talking to your teammates and your classmates. I put you guys in groups on Canvas so you guys can start talking. You don't have to use the groups on Canvas, but it's one way of putting all of your information in Canvas. So that way it's all in one spot. And I have access to the groups as well. So it's another way of me checking in on you all. So if you guys haven't talked in your groups yet, that is number one priority at this point is to talk to your groups. You need to have that first meeting completed by February 20th. And it needs to be a recording, either a visual recording like here on Zoom or an auditory recording. So if you just put your phone down and do the audio on your cell phone and upload that, that's perfectly fine. But it needs to be a recording of some sort. So that's number one. Number two, someone asked if it's normal for the module and the lecture not to be posted until Wednesday. No, it is not normal. It's supposed to be posted Sunday night, Monday morning at the latest. So this week, technology was not my friend. And going forward, it will be posted Sunday night or Monday morning at the latest. Um, but it still gives you plenty of time to do everything you need to do before the quiz. There will be a discussion post this week. I didn't post it because the lecture needs to be posted first because it's based off of lecture. So that will be coming to you. Um, and then someone had a confusion about the readings. So in my post and my announcement, I had said read, or in the quiz number two, I said the quiz number two is based off of these pages. And those pages were different than the ones that were on your homework for the readings. Again, quizzes are based off of the readings and lecture. The parts of the chapter that you are not reading, you are getting from me in lecture format. So, to recap, each chapter of the book has a lecture and a quiz and a reading assignment. So that's how I'm divvying up the chapter. So I'm going to be giving lecture on portions of the chapter. You're reading a portion of the chapter and put those two together. That is what you're using to take your quiz. Okay. So I just want to make sure that's perfectly clear. So for example, this lecture that we are doing right now is based off of pages 43 through page 65. So this lecture is a little bit different than the others. This lecture, we do have an overlap between lecture and the reading. And the reason for that is because the pages past page 63, the concepts are pretty broad and they're pretty complex. So I wanted to make sure we go over them in lecture just to have some supplemental instruction on what those terms and those concepts are. But it's not normally going to be like that. So read, whenever it says read in the syllabus or on Canvas, your homework for that week, just read those pages and everything else will be covered through me on lecture. Okay, that's the only thing you have to worry about. And then both of those two things will be used to make the syllabus questions. Okay. So without further ado, let's get into the actual lecture for today. Perfect. Okay, so we're doing groups as systems. So that's the chapter name for chapter 2. We are going to be focusing on, in 2 different separate lectures, the what groups as systems means, and then we're going to look at the interconnected parts of a group, and then we're also going to look at the and the influence of size. So those are the 2 major, or I guess three major concepts that we're going to be focusing on in this lecture. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so again, this is the context of my in-person class. So we have some reminders, we have lecture. I already did the reminders. And then the activity I'm going to have you do on your own. Learning objectives, we will define different terms related to group communication. We will summarize different theories of group dynamics in group communication, and we will evaluate our boundaries that we have through an activity. And again, that's something you'll do on your own. Okay, so 3 major concepts. But before we get into the major concepts, I'm going to be using terminology that has multiple meanings in different senses, and or you probably have not heard of them in these contexts before. So I want to make sure that you are aware of the definitions before we get into the 3 major concepts. So first thing, when I say groups as a system, you're probably thinking to yourself, what is that? And I don't blame you. So system is a set of interconnected parts working together to form a whole in the context of a changing environment. So if you look at, for example, your operating systems on your phone, iOS if you have iPhone, and then Android, whatever Android's is. That system has a bunch of interconnected parts that when they work together, they form a whole, the whole operating system in the context of a changing environment. That's why there's updates to the system, right? That's why we have system updates for different devices. So we make sure that we are responding to the changing environment, technological environment. The same thing is happening in groups. So a group is composed of individual members interrelating with each other as a whole entity. So all you have your individual ideas, your individual contributions to the group, and you're being forced to bring those all together for a common purpose, right? And that's the whole, or that's the individual parts, interrelated parts coming together to form a whole group. Okay. And the behavior of one person in the group affects the entire group, as we discussed last week. So that's why it's always interrelating. And that's why it's always forming, it's always shaping. Then we have something called an input. And an input consists of resources that come from outside the system, such as, this is more in a scientific term, but such as energy in the form of sunlight or electricity, information, internet, and books, and people, a new group member. So, what this is saying is because you guys at the end of the day are a bunch of individual people coming together to form a group, you also have individual prospects or individual differences, individual pieces of your identity that are coming together in this group setting. So, for example, if you identify as male compared to if you identify as female, or if you identify as non-binary, all of those different identifications of gender come into the group situation where those things are always going to be interconnected. If you have a group of all identifying females, it's going to be different than the all identifying male group. Or when we have one male and a group of all females, that dynamics can be different. So it's all of these interrelated inputs that have an effect on the group. Okay. Then we have something called entropy. It's entropy and can be found on page 44. is a measure of a system's movement toward disorganization and eventual termination. So entropy is not what we want in a group communication course or in a group setting in general. That's something that we should never strive for. That's when things get so out of hand, out of pocket, that the entire group just dismantles. So all living systems, so all living groups of people combat entropy with input. So a lot of the times when there's not enough input, there's not enough nuance coming into the group situation, it can cause, for example, no group can survive without new members. So there's always going to be a need for new input into the system. Whenever we get to a point in society or, yeah, in society in general, when there's so much people with the same attitude and the same concepts and the same blah, 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 it eventually leads to downfall because the members in the group want new stimuli. And we can't have new stimuli without new people, right? So that's when we have entropy, when we have a group that's so close knit to the point where they don't want to admit new members, is when we have a collapse. Okay. If this is sounding familiar in our current political climate, then yeah. Then we have throughput. This is the process of transforming input into output to keep the system functioning. So we'll get into output in a minute, but this is the sense where if things were new members, or rather, sorry, let me back up. So this process is when the members of the already existing group have this idea where we can still have the benefits of having new members, but what they're looking at is taking those concepts from like um from a one-off member, someone who is just coming to talk to the group, right? Or a guest speaker, taking those concepts and then incorporating it into the group to make it feel new, to keep the system functioning. Yeah. Yeah, so here's an input straight from the textbook. Input is transformed in a group by its members engaging in communication activities such as presenting information during group discussion and then taking the information and engaging in a creative problem solving. So that's one way. And then we also have structuration theory. And this theory is talking about a system, such as a small group, that establishes structures such as discussion, problem solving in the form of rules, norms, roles, and power distribution. So think about your different groups that you belong to, friend groups, family units, soccer teams, baseball teams, sports teams in general, all these different groups that you might belong to. Fandoms, if you're a fan of something and you belong to a group of people who also like that thing, that's called a fandom. All of these things. Structuration theory says that all groups are going to have some form of rules, roles, norms, and power distribution. Think about it. The Super Bowl just happened, right? Some of you are Chief fans, some of you are Eagles fans, some of you are neutral. You didn't care which team, or maybe you did, depending on the conference that you're in, right? Some of you belonged to one team or the other. And the Chiefs, for example, they have a tradition on the Fridays before a game to wear the team colors. That is a norm, that is a rule that was arbitrarily set. And then every Chief fan does it if they want to adhere to the group norm. So rules permit certain communication behaviors, polite discussions, team building, etc., while restricting others from engaging in communication behavior. So that's rambunctious debate or ridicule, right? So we all have rules. If you're doing something that the group does not like, they're gonna say something about it, right? Then we have output. Remember, I said we'll come back to output. So, output comprises the continual results of the group's throughput. So, transformation of input. So, once that whole process of throughput happens, then there's an output. There's something to put out into the world separate from the group. So, group outputs include decisions made. So, once that throughput has happened, the whole group comes to conclusion that issue is solved, that is put to the side. Solutions to problem created and implemented, projects completed. So in our class, the output that you guys are going to come together is you're going to come together with a presentation that teaches others about what different subdisciplines of communication studies there are and what they entail, things like that, right? Okay, now we can get back to the lecture. That was all the definitions. So we have this thing called a ripple effect, okay? And the ripple effect is essentially a chain reaction. So ripple effect or chain reaction spreads across the entire system. And our remember, system equals group, right? Much like a pebble that is thrown or tossed into a pond and disturbs the water and forces adjustment. So this is the concept of if a new person joins the group, it might cause some disruption. And that disruption causes a ripple effect across the whole group, right? Or if someone says something that we don't like or that we do not agree with, it might cause a ripple effect where other members are starting to turn on that new member, or other members are really thinking about maybe this group isn't what I thought it was, right? Those thoughts of a ripple effect happening, it's very delicate and it causes a chain reaction. Yeah. So a small little thing in any group can cause a huge and generate a huge ripple effect. So any small little disagreement can affect the whole group. So obviously we can't predict or try to be reactive to these disruptions, but we can be aware of them and be known or know how to handle them. Okay. And also, the ripple effect does not need to be a negative experience. It could be a very positive experience, but it's just something to be aware of. Then we have this thing called synergy. And synergy is literally so SYN at the beginning means together in Latin, and ergy, which comes from ergon, means work. So literally work together. So this is when a group performance from joint action of members exceeds expectations based on perceived abilities and skills of individual members. And that is straight from the books. That's from page 48 through 49. Okay. So there's two ways to ensure that your group is working together. One way is group members typically work together cooperatively to achieve a common goal. Your group has a common goal already. You actually have a couple common goals. The first one is the project, right? The presentation, teaching subdiscipline of communication to others. That's number one. Two, common goal is to pass the class, hopefully. And common goal number three, this might not be as common, but getting a high grade in the class. A lot of you have that goal. It's not as common as passing, but it's still there, still is active. And two, the second way to make sure that synergy is happening is when groups whose members have deep diversity have greater potential to produce synergy than groups with little such diversity. So lately, the word diversity has been a buzzword for both sides of the political aisle for many different reasons. Diversity in this sense means diversity of thought. So, not really exactly socioeconomic reasons, but that could have an impact. But we're really looking at deep diversity as a substantial variation among members in task relevant skills, knowledge, abilities, beliefs, values, perspectives, and problem-solving strategies. So it's more cognitive, different ways of looking at things in our world. People that bring on different concepts that we probably never even heard of. So synergy is a very positive thing to have. If your group has synergy, you're on a good track. Okay. And what's the opposite of positive? Negative, right? So negative synergy occurs when group members working together produce a worse result than expected based on perceived individual skills and abilities of members. So basically, when group members know a little bit about a subject, compete against each other, um, resist change, or share a collective bias or mindset, the result of mixing their individual contributions can produce decisions beyond bad. So what we're looking at here in negative synergy, synergy is working together. You're coming together despite differences, and you're coming together to incorporate those differences. Negative synergy is when we have this thing called a clique. If you were in high school recently, or if you remember back to high school, there might have been some cliques. And that is negative synergy because that means anyone that joins the group that wasn't already established is going to be looked down upon, and it's going to cause this ripple effect, right? So negative synergy is really talking about people or groups where concepts and ideas are shunned or when group members compete against each other. So you want to make sure you don't have that. And that comes through usually in the group presentations. If one member feels like they haven't done enough, or if one group member and another group member want to compete for attention and speaking time, that's when negative synergy can happen. It's when the group is not working together. Okay. Okay, so I did a little diagram here. And this diagram is really talking about how to deal with difficult group members. And I use this analogy of clouds, rain contributing to the water, and then the water contributing to a river, which goes to the mountain and creates greenery, right? So, one way to look at this is look at the clouds as your group climate. So group climate, really talking about when you guys first have that first meeting and subsequent meetings towards the beginning of the group formation, whatever norms and rules that you guys had set at that time come into play throughout the whole time you guys are together. It creates a ripple effect. So if you start out strong in your groups, it's a very good, positive, energizing um, group climate. It's going to have an effect on the rest of the time that you guys are together. So make certain that the group climate is cooperative, meaning it's always functioning, it's always working. Obviously, some things might hit the fan, but being able to navigate that. So again, this diagram is talking about dealing with difficult group members. So if you don't want difficult group members, make sure you create a group climate where voices are heard and where voices are valued. So no one feels alienated. Okay. And then establish a code of conduct, establish rules, establish meeting times, establish how you as a group would like others to function in the group in terms of communication. Like, do we want active communication where we talk at least once a week just to check in on things? Or do we want more communication? That's something for your group to decide. And that's something that should be decided by the whole group and not by one person. If if someone goes against the code of conduct that was established by your group, then we need to change the communication in relation to the person's difficult behavior. So one way is to not placate the troublemaker. So basically, if someone in the group is being disruptive and the whole group seems to have this negative feeling about this group member, it's time to confront that person. Really try to make sure that they know that what they're doing is disruptive, but also don't reciprocate it. So if they're being difficult, don't be difficult back. Be open, but also confront them and say, hey, listen, we're not liking this vibe. You gotta chill. Yeah. You can also remove yourself mentally from the conversation and think about it from that person's perspective, how they're coming across. Maybe there's something that you're not seeing, and maybe your first instinct is, oh my God, this person's being disruptive. But are they? Really take yourself away from the situation mentally and just really look at the disruptor and see what if they're actually what they're contributing is actually helpful. And if it's not, then it's disruptive, right? And also don't provide a soapbox for the troublemaker. If they're saying stuff that's not cool, that's not what the group is liking to hear and what the group is thinking is the, a good use of their time, then you need to cut it off real fast. Okay. Then we get to constructive contribution. So this is the fourth attempt. If you've done everything else at this point, this is the last step before you get into some more serious ways of combating a difficult group member. You can attempt to convert disruption into a constructive contribution. So maybe there's some elements of what this person is saying that's actually helpful. And maybe you can really pinpoint that and really focus in on that to distract the disruptor from feeling alienated. Again, this is all about input. If the input's coming in that's disruptive, maybe change that, transform that into a beneficial output. Okay. If that has not worked, then you can have a one-on-one conversation with the person that's being disruptive. If you feel like having that conversation, or maybe the group can have it, where you guys all confront that person and tell them how it makes you feel if it's really disruptive. If that doesn't work, then you can separate from that person entirely, which means coming to me and let me know this person's being disruptive, and then I can have a conversation with them individually. Okay. But those are all tactics that you can use to ensure that the disruptor does not totally derail the conversation and the group project. And this is where we get into boundaries. So openness refers to the degree of continuous interchange with the outside environment. So when we talk about boundaries, you might have heard of this word. It's been used a lot in pop culture recently, but your parents all had boundaries when you were growing up. Don't come or come home before 10 p.m., come home before midnight, whatever it was. That was a boundary that they had with you. And these are interpersonal boundaries, and it can also be group boundaries, right? So if the boundary in your group is to uphold regular communication to make sure that we're all on the same page, that's a boundary that has been set by the whole group and it should be upheld. Okay. And openness refers to the degree of how open you are with discussing those boundaries and or how open you are with setting those boundaries. Okay. Then we have adaptability. So this is the change in the adjustment of group boundaries in response to a changing condition. So how adaptable are you as a group when situations arise? What if one of your group members can't meet because someone passed in their family? How are you guys going to be able to navigate and adapt that missing person from the group situation? Normally, you guys are all pretty much in the same age group, so I would imagine it's pretty okay with most of you if that happens. But again, a boundary is also adaptability and also boundary control, which is what we're getting into now. And that determines the amount of access a group has to input and thus influence from outsiders. So, someone can't meet because of various different reasons. If that's okay with the group, let it slide, let them know that, they really want really want them to be there, but that you understand the situation. The boundary control comes in and says, yes, that's fine. You have an input of there's something happening. I can't meet. that influence has set in on the group, saying, oh, we have a member missing today, so it's just going to be us. And that's going to determine how you move forward in that group meeting. Okay. Then we have physical boundaries. And this is really referring to protecting your group space. So if you're meeting in public, the best idea is to get into a place where physically you guys can really dedicate time to the project. This is good if you're at the library or a place where you could be in a room, secluded in a room in a group. Coffee shops aren't the best place for physical barriers because there's noise. And remember, we talked about noise last week. There's noise that can distort and make the communication process difficult because of the literal noise, but also the noise in the communication channels. So physical barriers are good boundaries to have, especially for a functioning group. We want to make sure that everyone can hear each other, make sure that everyone is physically able to see each other, right? If it's on Zoom, make sure your cameras are on so you can ensure that everybody in the group is having contribution. Then there's psychological barriers. So this is when a member's contribution during group discussion is ignored or the member is treated as an outcast. So we're all trying to pass this class, right? That's a common goal that you all have. Everyone's contribution in some way, some shape or form is going to benefit the group, unless it's disruptive. But again, we're trying to get that deep diversity. One way of doing that is to make sure that psychological barriers are not in place. Okay. Linguistic barriers, this is simply put, when barriers are put in place to block linguistically other members from contributing. So again, we have a term called bypassing. We don't want to assume that everyone has the same definition as others. So you want to make sure that your communication is on point in that sense. Boundaries quiz, I'm going to send this to you guys in email separately. And then this will contribute to our discussion board for this week. Okay, so now we got to our second part of the lecture, and this is from pages 66 through the end of the chapter. So this is the last part of the chapter 2 text. Okay. Perfect. So we are screen sharing. Okay, so we're talking about the influence of size now. Okay. So we're going to be exploring different ways size impacts groups. Okay. Okay, so lecture on group size and complexity. We're really going to talk about that complexity part. Lecture on organization within the group. Lesson objectives for this part. We're going to understand how different amount of people in a group affects group performance through examples. Assess how non-participants are more common in larger groups. And then summarizing how information distortion is common in organizations. This is for something for you to answer on your own. When we talk about groups and the ideal size of a group, what number of people are you thinking of? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? What is the number? Think to yourself. If you had an ideal number of people in a group, what would it look like? How many people? Is it 2, 4, 8? What are you thinking? So the answer is there's no true number. There's no ideal number. There never is going to be. But the size of the group, as the size of the group increases, so does the complexity. So if you're trying to limit complexity, you should limit it to at least 3 people. And 2 is not a group. 2 is a couple. 2 is a dyad. So that is interpersonal communication, not group communication. So if you want to lower the amount of complexity, then you would lower to a smaller number of people. But even then, even if you do lower it to lower the complexity, theoretically, it really depends on who's in the group and how much input you're getting, how much output you're getting, how much throughput you're getting, right? So even then, even if the ideal number is three for small group communication, there's various different sizes of groups that someone can be a part of, right? So when we're talking about small group communication, then yes, we are talking about the ideal number is 3 to 5 groups or 5 people. Okay. That is the ideal number. So the chapter gives you a little graph here, and it says that 3 people, if there's 3 people in the group, that means that there's 9 possible different interactions that can impact the group and can influence the group. There's 9 possible different interactions. Once we go up to 4 people in a group, it goes up to 28 interactions that can affect the group. And if you had 8, that is 1,056 interactions. So imagine how many different interactions that could impact your group, depending on the size of the group. So here's some benefits, or sorry, here are some drawbacks on large groups compared to small groups. So in our senses here, we're designating large groups as more than 6 people. Okay. More than 6 people in our terms is what's considered a large group. Here's a question. Is our class considered a large group or a small group? This should be easy. Okay. Think about that. So, some negative characteristics of a large group. Studies have shown that large groups typically have more non-participants than smaller groups. Those of you in the physical classroom, if you're in the physical classroom and other classes, you might want to sit in the back of the room because you think that the professor or teacher is going to notice you less. By the way, that's not a thing. If anything, they'll notice you more. So just so you know. But you do that because you might not be as interested in the subject matter, but you have to take it for general education, right? So you think sitting in the back is going to be more beneficial. And that contributes to non-participating, right? Because you're not as interested in the discussion or in the subject matter. So large groups, psychologically, we think that will be noticed less. And that's why large groups has this negative on it that it allows for more non-participants. And the same token, less cooperation. If you think that you're going to be a fly on the wall in these large groups, that means you're probably not going to contribute as much. You're not going to add, you're not going to have that input into the group. And studies have shown that people are actually less satisfied in large groups compared to small groups. Okay. So those are some drawbacks for large groups. The positives are that when you have a large group, you have a lot more input. You have this deep diversity, right? Because you have all of this input, all these different people that are coming together and talking about and concluding and using past experiences to make decisions, etc. Right? So there is a positive, of course. There's deep diversity in large groups compared to small groups. Okay, so drawbacks to small groups. There's bigger opportunities for disagreement. So the reason why this is because small groups, again, are 3 to 5 people. There's less opportunity for people to form cliques or less opportunities for people to be like trying to adhere to what the group consensus is. This is called the spiral of silence theory. The theory is saying that when there are people who have strong opinions about something or are too afraid to voice their opinion about something because of what other members in the group have thought, and verbally said makes them feel like they can't say what they want to say because they already know that the majority of the group thinks one way or the other. So in small groups, there's bigger opportunities for disagreement because there's less room for people to team up with each other on someone else or someone else's idea. Doesn't mean that it will happen, just means that there's bigger opportunities for these disagreements. There's bigger opportunities for people to say, no, I think we should do this way, while someone else says, no, I think we should do it this way. Okay. So if size is influential, but not something that determines how a group will perform per se, then how much of an impact does it really have? If you've been thinking this question, I don't blame you. If size is such a big factor when it comes into small group communication versus group communication, then why do we even talk about size? If it doesn't really matter, like I said earlier, it doesn't really matter the size of the group. It's not, there's no ideal number. And I told you to think about that. And the reason why it doesn't technically matter, but it does have an influence, right? As we've seen, because it depends on the flow of information. And this is where information distortion comes in. So, information distortion, it really depends on what the purpose is for the group. It also really depends on how much information needs to be contained in the group. So, for example, little petty squabbles between two group members in at Google, for example, that discussion usually doesn't go past their immediate managers, right? Their managers are usually able to do some conflict resolution, get those two team members to work it out or separate them, whatever the case may be. Those hierarchical structures, like Google, for example, their size of the organization doesn't really matter because it's so big that there's so many people that can mitigate any negative synergy. Smaller groups like a mom and pop shop, for example, those two members might be the majority of the group organization. That might be the majority of that small mom and pop's organization. And those two team members having the squabble will affect the synergy of the whole business, right? So it really depends on the flow of information. So the size of the group doesn't technically matter. If you want to control some of the negatives of of a large group, if you want to control the way or how many non-participants you might have, if you want to control the amount of cooperation and the satisfaction of the group members, then you should opt in for a small group. If you want to have less disagreement, then you should have a large group. So it really depends on that information and how that's going to be impacted. Okay. So that's what we're looking at in chapter 2, looking at groups as systems, and we're also looking at the influence of size. Again, influence of size doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because it's all dependent on the information. But once that information is once that information is talked about and decided upon, then the size does matter. Okay. So that's what we're looking at. In these group presentations, it's a simple presentation about teaching others. 3 people is plenty. Okay. If we were talking about teaching the whole discipline of communication studies, then we're going to need to expand that group to accommodate for that size of that task. Okay. That's what we're looking at. Let me know if you have any questions. Remember, we do have office hours on Wednesdays. So far, no one has come to see me, which means I'm doing something right, or you guys are too scared, whatever the case may be. If you have any questions, shoot me an email or come to my office hours. Okay. We'll see you guys next week.